The use of paper as money is an important abstraction in the history of finance and payments because it helps us move away from utilizing metal, which could, of course, be used for other purposes, for a purpose of denoting it as a reference currency for which all other things could be exchanged. Now, paper, importantly, is like earlier fiat currencies in that it does not carry any physical commodity value in and of itself. Instead, in many cases, it represents a legal claim on resources from the issuer's coordination system. In effect, paper money is usually a debt of the issuer, a topic we'll be discussing more in our next series of videos. Importantly, paper is also much less expensive to manufacture and can be created in any denomination, as was demonstrated by Zimbabwe during their currency collapse in the late 2000s. As a matter of fact, we had currency issued in the range of 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars, not as a total amount, but as a single bill of issue. Now, interestingly enough, the beginnings of paper money emerge in Tang, China, during periods when copper, or sufficient copper to effectuate all the financial transactions, was rare. And so this led to the development during the Tang period of what was called feiqian, or flying money. Effectively, these were receipts that could be used to draw on state resources and other parts of the country, and effectively acted as a checking system. This enabled the use of paper not only as a claim on physical real assets, but also to circulate as a medium of exchange, ultimately finally being collected by the person who used it to extract the underlying asset. Now, the first state-backed currency, the first sort of feiqian that we see issued by the state as opposed to private merchant issuers or particular government departments, was the jiaozi that the Song dynasty institutes in 1024. That was the first time that we see the state backing a widespread public use of paper as a means of transmitting value between them. Now, at the time, paper money was not used in exclusion to metal, it was used alongside them. The two systems were exchangeable for one another. And what you can see here, actually, is an example of the first jiaozi from 1024 AD. You'll note that there are some pretty serious intricacies on this document here. Now, this document, of course, did not survive in its paper form itself. We only have indication of what it looked like based on printing blocks which survived from that time. So I'd like to draw your attention to some of the features that we see on this first paper currency. The first thing to note is the level of detail and intricacy. This increases over time as it was seen originally as being designed to thwart people's attempt to create counterfeit currencies. A second aspect of it you'll note is all these circular symbols with the square holes punched through them. What are the sort of familiar cash coins that began to be used in the Eastern Zhou dynasty over 15 centuries before. This helps people to understand that this circulating piece of paper is in fact money and can be exchanged, interestingly enough, for coin at a rate of 770 yen, or a full string of cash for this particular piece of paper security. Finally, you'll note the inscriptions here in the center panel and along the edge of the building in the illustration panel, which reads, "Valid for public and private payments in all circuits, prefectures, and counties outside of Sichuan. Shall circulate at a par with coin at 770 yen to a rate of exchange." This small cartouche in the bottom corner of the illustration simply says, "May there be 1,000 such storehouses." And you can see that this is supposed to represent the idea that there are physical goods that underlie this currency, and that this piece of paper is equivalently exchangeable for the metallic coins that people had grown accustomed to using over the prior 15 centuries. Now, another form of early paper currency that we encounter in the same period in China is what we call the jiaoyin. The jiaoyin began to circulate around 985, but it was not a commonly used public currency. Rather, the jiaoyens were commodity receipts. At the time, the Song dynasty was spending a great deal of money to fortify its northern borders, and in order to reward merchants for bringing goods and supplies to the northern border, rather than paying them in cash, which of course would have required them to move large volumes of cash to an unstable border region, they instead paid merchants with these commodity vouchers, pieces of paper that would allow them to withdraw fixed quantities of generally salt or tea from state warehouses located throughout the empire. Now, both of these trades at the time were regulated by the government, so the right to purchase from the state these commodities at a fixed price and a fixed markup effectively equated to a form of payment. Now, these commodity vouchers were transferable, which means that it's perhaps unsurprising that the Chinese merchants who were active in delivering these goods to the northern frontier began to use these commodity vouchers as a form of currency between them. Now, of course, convertibility of these certificates was suspended during war times, which was a semi-regular event for the Sung. But nonetheless, this form of paper money managed to retain its value for very long periods of time because there was no concern about an overprinting of paper. And the reason for this is because each piece of paper had a fixed amount of commodities associated with it. And each time a Xiaoyan was issued, the commander who was responsible for having accepted the goods for which it was payment had to put their own name on it, which meant that it was rather difficult to get away with fraudulent transactions or the issuance of excessive Xiaoyans beyond what was needed. Now, of course, there are inefficiencies with the use of paper money, just like there are inefficiencies with the use of metal or any other kind of payment, quite frankly. In general, paper wears out rather quickly and does need to be frequently replaced. Even though the cost of each unit of paper money might be relatively low, modern paper money, for instance, tends to burn out and need to be recycled within 2 years. Canadians recently switched to a plastic polymers away from cotton bills, and this allowed us to extend the lifespan of Canadian currency to as much as 3 to 3.5 years instead of the 2 that we typically used. The other big problem with paper money is not just that it wears out and needs to be replaced. The traditional jiaozhis issued in China during the Song dynasty were actually only had a lifespan of 3 years. But the big problem is, of course, counterfeiting. Counterfeiting among metallic coins could be checked by density, the water displacement versus its mass, but you can't do that same sort of thing with paper money. And so we had to rely on other kinds of techniques in order to try to foil counterfeiters who might simply try to print up their own paper money and pass it off as official currency. When someone does this, what it effectively does is steals money from all of the other users of that currency system by increasing the amount of money that's in circulation relative to the amount of goods. And that makes the value of each unit of currency lower. So counterfeiters are fundamentally stealing from other people who use the currency. And so protections against counterfeits were relatively important. The Song developed multiple colors in their designs, as many as 3 or 4 different colors. At first, they only printed paper currency on mulberry bark because this was very, very hard to counterfeit. And of course, the simple legalist technique of threatening counterfeiters with execution worked fairly well. But there were other modern innovations. For instance, Benjamin Franklin, if we take a look at the link on the slide that's labeled Inefficiencies of Paper Currency, you'll see that he instituted a technique called nature printing to try to reduce the possibilities of counterfeits, both among documents and financial instruments. If we take a look at some of the more modern techniques that are used in the 20th and 21st century, we saw the introduction of magnetic wires into each bill to make electronic counting much easier. Also, if a bill wasn't slightly magnetic, it was definitely fake. We see the use of embossed textures, irregular edging, watermarks, and even now holograms in the 21st century on all of the bills that we carry in our pockets, for those few of us who are still carrying paper money. An interesting side note can be seen if you take a look at old Canadian or the most recent run of Canadian currencies that have a little hole in them. If you shine a laser, like a laser pointer used to play with cats, through that onto a wall in a dark room, you'll see that it actually shows up, denoting what kind of currency it has. This is one of the security features that wasn't disclosed to us when these currencies were issued, but some clever Redditors discovered it. You can see how exactly the verification technique works by taking a look at that Reddit link. Now, the other final problem associated with paper currency, and perhaps the most damning thing, which has prevented it from being universally accepted when it was first issued about 1,000 years ago, was the note that there was no physical limit on the supply of it, which meant that the issuer, as long as you had paper and ink, could literally continue to print up money. And just like a counterfeiter devalues currency by creating fake currency, the issuer themselves can devalue the currency by simply printing too much of it relative to the amount of goods and the volume of transactions. And this, of course, devalues the currency. We'll be talking a lot more about monetary policy starting in a couple of weeks when we look into central banking and the issuance of money. Now, it's worth noting that paper money in its first incarnation in China actually did not survive the political trials of the 11th through 13th centuries. The first overprinting of paper money that led to a cratering of its currency occurred during the Song dynasty's latter years. In 1127, a northern group, the Jin, conquered the Jin conquered the northern capital of Kaifeng and seized 100 billion copper coins from the imperial treasury, which of course meant that there was a sudden shortage of copper coins for transaction, and the government needed to print up more paper money to simply prevent the economy from stalling out. However, as things got worse, with the Mongols subsequently conquering the Jin and engaging in further war with the southern Song, we actually see that the use of mulberry bark for paper money breaks down as well, and this of course encourages an enormous amount of counterfeit, such that by the end of the Song's dynasty, the value of their printed paper currencies fell by more than 99%. Now, it's worth noting that their successors, the Yuan dynasty or the Mongols, were no better at managing the money supply. In order to maintain their fantastic consumption, they tended to print up as much paper currency as they felt was convenient and used it to pay for luxurious goods and services delivered both by the locals and from people overseas. The subsequent devaluation of currency that results from this overprinting actually undermines the economy of the Yuan dynasty and leads to subsequent revolts as people no longer feel that the mandate of heaven can reasonably be expected to be borne by the Yuan. That clearly, the economic problems which have emerged are a sign of heaven's displeasure, and so an uprising emerges in response to this economic collapse, which drives the Yuan from power and brings in the following Chinese dynasty, the Ming. The Ming dynasty don't do any better than their predecessors do at all. It seems that the lesson of overprinting paper money was completely lost on them as well. Within 20 years, their new currency, the baochao, had fallen in value by as much as 80%. By 1430s, the Ming have completely abandoned this idea of using paper money and simply prefer to return to the traditional techniques of using metal as currency. And as a result, paper money doesn't return into widespread use in China until 1930. But as we'll see in the next set of videos, paper doesn't die there, and we'll have to try to understand what causes its revival at the other end of the Eurasian continent.